Hey, welcome to the first video on my channel. I thought as most of us are in lockdown, it's probably a good time for me to throw together a quick tutorial on testing with Jest in Angular. Sorry in advance for all the car sounds. I live right next to a main road, and so sorry if that's a bit distracting. So today we're going to look at unit testing only with Jest. We're going to learn how to test basic functions, mock dependencies and services, mock responses from observables, and if we get time, we're going to look at how to handle promises as well in Jest. We're not going to look at how to set up Jest in an Angular project. I'm happy to do a video on that, so if you want to see it, just leave me a comment below and I'll throw together a video. So let's jump straight over to our project now. Now what you'll see is it's a really simple project that I've just thrown together to demonstrate these tests. We've got the main workers component here. From that we've got a child component, which is a new worker form. We've got a service, which is where we get our workers and submit our workers. And then we've got some of these utility classes and services, one for a loader, an error handler, and a dialogue, so like a pop-up to give you your successes or your errors. This is very typical for most Angular projects that I use on a day-to-day basis. First off, we're going to look at this new worker form component because it's actually quite typical of a lot of components that I look at in Angular, and we're going to cover quite a lot in here. So if we just get familiar with the component itself, we've got some dependencies injected, which are these utility ones we were looking at before. We've got a lifecycle hook on a init that calls a method to set up the main form. We've then got a method here to submit the form. We've got some functionality here for if it's successfully submitted, and we've got a method here that's called when it fails, and that method handles the dialogue or the pop-up telling the user that something's gone wrong. So we're going to open our spec file here, snap it to the other side of the screen so we can see both here. Now first thing that we need to do, zoom in a little bit here so we can see everything, and do the same here. So first off, we need to add a describe. Now, if you're not familiar with describes, they're exactly what they sound like. They describe all of the code that sits inside them, i.e. the tests. So you can nest describes as heavily as you want. I nest quite a lot. I prefer my tests to be really easy to read through. And when you get quite complicated components down the line, you're going to want to nest so that at a glance, when a test fails, you know exactly what method failed. So here, our first describe that we use needs to describe what all of these tests in this spec file are. So we'll give it the name of the component. We then need to create a fixture that we're going to test. I call this fixture. You'll see in other places on blogs and stuff, some people call this component or service depending on what they're testing. I blanket use the term fixture just to make it very clear when you're looking through my tests, this is the class that I am testing. So now we need to use a before each. Before eaches, once again, are exactly what they sound like. Before each test within this describe block, this set of code will run. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a new instance of our class that we're testing. You might ask yourself, well, why aren't we setting this up just once at the beginning of doing our tests? And it's because we don't want any of our units that we're testing to impact other units that we're testing. We want them all to be standalone. That way, if we're leveraging one of the great things from Jest where you can run tests concurrently, you don't have to worry about sometimes this test fails because a variable has been updated to this or that. Here we've got a red underline. That's because it's saying it's expecting 3 arguments, which are these dependencies here. So we need to mock these dependencies, and I say mock, we're not going to be creating instances of them here because we're not testing these dependencies, we're testing this class. So let's make it very clear that these are mocked. Take each of these, and the third one here. And then we put each of these in here. It doesn't care about what types these are, it just cares that a value is passed in here. Down the line, when we're using some of the methods in these dependencies, we will actually have to mock them, but for now we can just put the empty variables in there. Now this component is ready to start writing tests. So the first set of tests that I like to write are component setup tests. Now what I would put in these are things that happen in ng init. Also, if we have any values that have to be set at the beginning for this component to be created. So if, let's say for example, if this was actually input, here we've said that if is submitting is not set or passed in, we will set it to false. So I might want to write a test to make sure that this is actually being set to false, because down the line I might be relying on that. But as this is a very simple component, the only thing that we'll be testing in this component setup block is ng on init. But still, create here and I do setup component. As I say, we can nest these as heavily as we want. And then inside this setup component, we're going to be testing, as I say, this ng on init. Take this and put it here. This might seem a little bit like overkill, but when you've got a really complex component down the line, you're going to really thank yourself that you really nested these so that it's clear to see which tests failed. So we write our first it. Its can't be nested, they're not like describes in that way. It is one it for one test. And we use the it should syntax. So if we try to put this into words, it should call generate worker form with this.worker. So literally type that. It should call this method with this value. Now the way I like to lay out my tests is with the 3 A's of testing. That's arrange, act, assert. Arrange being set up my test, act being run my test, assert being this should happen when I run my test. So to set this up, we need to spy on this, and spy is just a term that is used in Jasmine as well, and some other testing frameworks. It's just watching something for a change. So in this case, we are watching this method. Let's make it clear that this is a spy. We use the Jest keyword, spy on. We look inside the fixture for this method. It's as simple as that. We now have a way of looking at things that happen to this method. That's our arrange. Then our act is we need to call this. You might think that this is called automatically when this component is instantiated. That's actually not true when you're doing unit tests. Any lifecycle hooks you need to call yourself, which is great because it means you can really just test one method. You don't have to worry about on change being fired and all these other things happening. So here we need to go to our fixture dot ng on init. Next we do our assertion. So we go expect. What do we expect? We expect this to be called with. You can also use Jasmine's to have been called with. You'll notice that a lot of the assertions have crossover. And that's because Jest was originally built on Jasmine. To have been called with, and we need to create this variable of what it's going to be called with. If we go here, const worker, what is our model? Here is our model. Now, you'll see me doing this a lot in tests. I don't think this is great practice when you're writing TypeScript itself. I think this is actually a bit of a cheat and can cause you more trouble than value it actually adds. But with tests, I don't care what value is passed to my method. I just care that when I call on init, a value is passed through to my method. I'm going to give it a few basic things. So we'll go worker1 is the ID, and we'll give it a name, Travis Barker. Great drummer. So what I need to do is I need to go to my fixture. I need to set my worker because we need, when this is called, the worker to be passed through. And now there's actually a few ways that we can run our tests here. We can go here, we can go run test. That will run all of the tests inside the describe block, and it will do it in this nice little formatted way here. If I go down here, like, you can see all of the nests that I was putting in here, all of our describe blocks here. And then it gives us details about the tests that are actually running, and you get these nice little ticks by the side. This is great if you're running all of your tests once at the end, but the way that we're going to be writing our tests, I actually prefer to use jest watch, and that will do exactly what it sounds. It runs a watcher. Every time I change this file, it will rerun these tests. I can press A in here and it will run all of the tests in my project, or I can leave it in watcher mode and it will just run the tests that have been updated or the tests that have failed. It's really, really useful. It's one of the major benefits of using Jest over some of the other testing libraries. You can see here that our first test has succeeded. Just to make sure that it is succeeding and that's not a false positive, if I put here null, this should fail. And here it tells us it expected null, which is what we told it to expect, but it actually received this. So if we set this back to worker, it's another great thing about Jest. The errors that you get given are very, very precise, tell you exactly where, like what line, and how your tests failed. So that's our first test, and that's actually all of our component setup tests done. As I say, on a much more complex component, there might be a lot more going on here. Now, the next thing, if we scroll down here, the next test that we want to look at is setting up this form. So we do the same thing that we did a minute ago. We create a describe. Inside this describe, we're going to give it the method name. We'll pass it a fat arrow function there. So what I'm actually going to do, because we're going to be creating a lot of these, so I'm going to be a bit lazy, create a load down here. This actually just goes to show that it doesn't matter how many describes you have on the page. If they're empty, it will just run through the tests with no worries. So here, do the same thing. We get our method name. Now we have to look at what the method is trying to do here. Let's move this down here so we can see the whole method. So what it's trying to do here is it's generating a form. If a worker is passed in, it will use the values from that worker. So if worker and worker.id, it's not the most elegant way of putting this, but then use that, else generate a random ID, and so on through this. So I would say the first two tests that we want to write for this is a test to check that the form is generated with the values passed in, and a test to check to see if it is generated with default values if one isn't passed through. So using the it should syntax again, it should generate form with passed values. And then we take this with default. You'll see me doing this a lot. Anything that's very, very important to the test, I tend to do in caps. I actually don't know why I did it with default. I'm going to change that. I tend to do it with nots or shoulds, so it's very clear when you're looking down, should not do blah. So, similar to what we did up here, let's take this, put this here. For the sake of this test though, we actually want to pass all the values in. So we've got a role here. We're going to give it great drummer. It's got an ID. What else is there? And active. We're going to set active to, what's the default? Okay, we're going to set it to false. So this is our arrange. We need to set this up, and then we need to do our act, which is fixture dot. We want to generate this form. We want to pass in our worker. Now, the easiest way to check a form's values is by literally just doing that. Go get the form, value, and then we want to use to equal, and actually it's just going to equal this because the form structure is the same as the worker that we're passing in. If we had a slightly more complex form, we might have expected result here, but we're trying to keep things as simple as possible. So this should work. If we run these, our tests are running again. I've just saved it, our tests are running. Oh, we've got a failed test. And so our test has actually found our first problem in our code. We've got this check here that's basically saying, oh no, here, it's saying if worker and worker active, but we're checking a boolean. So really, this needs to be does not equal null, because otherwise it's always going to be true and it's going to set true here. This is our test has just found our first bug in our code here. So if I save this again, and there you go, those tests have now passed. In my mind, our tests have now done their job. They've found a bug in our code. It's worthwhile us writing these tests. So now we want to do a similar test, but we want to see what would happen if we didn't pass initial values. So we're going to take a bit of copy and pasting again here. We're going to take this, and this is going to be our expected result. We want to change this to be our expected result. We're going to pass undefined here because we don't want to pass anything to this method. Now, what are the default values here? So if nothing is passed for the name, it needs to be null. If nothing is passed for the role, it's an empty array. And if nothing is passed for active, we set this to true. We're still going to have a failed test here though, because we've got this dynamically generated ID, and there's no way of knowing what that is going to be in our tests. So Jest has actually got a built-in way to deal with unknowns. We use expect, any, and then all we need to do here is tell it what type of value it is. So as long as this ID is returning a string, we don't care. It's the rest of the values that are in there that make sense. You can actually do a lot more complex stuff with that, but in this case, we just want it to be a string here. So if I run my tests again, I save these, and there you go. We've got 3 pass tests here. Now, you can do a lot more complex stuff when you're testing forms. We could do some extra tests where we populate a few of these to make sure that it's not valid with required, or make sure that it's not valid when the length is too long. For now, I'm just going to move on to the next test because you get the point here. So if we move down and we take this describe and we put this here, and the next tests that we need to write are tests for submitting the worker form. This is where things are going to start getting a little bit more complex, but you'll actually see when you start doing it, it's actually not as complex as it looks. So if we create our initial describe here, now inside we're going to have quite a few describes. Now the first thing I can look at here with this method is that if the form is not valid, I don't want anything to happen. So I like to put a describe in here saying form not valid, and then another one saying form valid. There might only be one test in this, form not valid, but I think it's a lot clearer when we look at it later on. So it should, what should it do? It should not call, let's say that it's not going to call this if, we don't even need if because it's wrapped here. Okay, so we've got a few more complicated things to play with here now. We need to create a form and make sure it's not valid. Now we've already done that above. So if we take this and put this here, we now have a generated form that is not valid because we know that by default it sets this to null and it's a required field. So we should be able to, if we go here and we go fixture, we're calling this method, and now we expect, it's a bit like what we've done before, we expect this to not be called. But we actually haven't mocked this yet, so we need to go back up to the top of our file here. And do you remember earlier on I said here that we were going to have to mock some of these? So for this one, we go here, we use another built-in Jest feature here. So we take this method name from here, and then we go jest.fn. Now if we click through to fn, we'll see here what it does. It returns a mock function. So what this is allowing us to do, it's allowing us to at any point during our tests to call this.this and then give it a mock return. This is going to become actually really handy further down in our tests. For now, we just want to use this in the same way that we used our spies earlier on. If I go worker service mock dot, and then we want to go not to be called. This test should pass now. There we go. So it's as simple as that. That's the only test that we need for not valid. So now we need to look at valid tests. And I would say the first test we need to do is the complete opposite of this test. So if we copy and paste this in here, it should call this. Now, how have we had valid forms in the past? If we scroll up and we steal this, we come back down to here, we put this here, and we want to pass this in here. This is now a valid form. Now we are going to run into an issue because we've got some, up until now we've been dealing with only synchronous behaviour. We've now got some asynchronous behaviour happening, and we need this observable, because this is return an observable that's being subscribed to. Although we don't care about what's being returned in this method, for our test to finish, we need all things to return. So if we take what we did a minute ago, let's get rid of that. If we take this, we put it here, we go here, we can go mock return value. We use the shorthand for an observable, which is of. Back in the day, this would have been creating a new observable. And then it doesn't matter what value we pass here, because we just want this to complete. We don't care what value gets passed through. When we use this mock return value, it takes something that is asynchronous and actually makes sure that it happens straight away in a synchronous fashion. So we're saying that as soon as this method is called, when it gets to this, it will return true straight away, which allows our tests to run. We've got ourselves a little error here, and it's because we've got some more things that now need to be mocked. Now it seems, I know, like a lot of work mocking all these things, but you only have to do them once per file and then you're fine. So if we go back up to here, we need to do the same as what we did just above. What does our error tell us? It tells us that set loader state. So we've got here, set loader state is actually being, is being called. So if we go here and we go jest.fn again, we don't put a semicolon there we go. We don't actually need to mock that because it's not returning anything. It just needs to be there, because otherwise, if we look here, it's saying it can't get this of undefined because we're mocking that class or that dependency, so it can't find that method. Whereas now, it's finding our mocked method and it's calling it. It doesn't care what that method is, it's calling it and it's fine. So what happens here? The next thing that happens is submitting gets set to true. Now this is where we're going to see a little bit of a shortfall of these testing libraries, and I've never actually found a way of fixing this, and if anybody does know any ways, that would be great. Write down in the comments and I'll be eternally grateful. But I actually don't know a way of testing that this is set to true, and the reason for that is because when this succeeds, it's then set to false again. So we're going to skip over this one, because the way that if I was really worried about testing this in the real world, I could take this, pull it out into a method, and I could check to have been called, which is exactly what we're going to do with this next one. So we're going to test that. It should call this with true. It doesn't matter that it's going to call it with false, because we're going to check that the first time it calls it with true. So if we go it here. I don't know why I type that 0 every time. So we go here, it should call, I'm going to take this whole lot here, with true. So, we need to take most of what we've done up here and put it in here. And this is getting a bit gross because we've got lots and lots of duplicated code. So this is where before each comes in handy. We know that for each of these tests in this block, in this form valid block, the form must be valid. So there's no point of us repeating that code over and over and over again. So we take everything that makes that form valid, we take this, we plonk it in here, and we can now move that up. We don't need to duplicate this code because we know the form's valid already, and we can put this here. We're gonna keep this mock in here because in a minute we're gonna be writing tests that depend on what value is returned. So for now we're gonna keep this here. It doesn't matter that that's slightly duplicated. We've removed a lot of the duplicated code here. So we want to spy on this in the same way that we spied before. We care what it's been called with. To have been called, we actually want this one, nth. Now the first parameter we pass in is when it was called, so it's the first time it was called, and the second one is what we want it to be called with, so true. So we're saying that this, change to mock, that this gets called firstly with this. Now, we could here say that the second time it's called, it's then called with something else, false, but I don't like to do that. I like to have one test with one expect. It means there's a lot more tests, but it makes it very clear later on what thing broke your test. So, I think this will have already run in the background, but we go here, this should now succeed. So we're now up to 6 tests. Now we're getting to actually returning from our observable. Once again, I would put 2 describes here because there's 2 outcomes here. We can say submission successful and submission failed. So with our successes, we need a lot of the same stuff that's already happened. In here, we know one more thing about our test now. We know that all of them succeed, which means we can use another before each. And in here, we can take what we've done here, plonk that there. We can take this here, some more copying and pasting. We can go expected, or call that response. So we take our response and we return it from here. So now, whenever this is called, it will within this block, it will return this response successfully. Now we need to look at what tests we have in here. So there's 3 tests that I can see. The first one is that worker is set to the returned value. So, should set this dot worker to returned value. The second thing we should do is this should be set to false. So let's create another test for this. And because this is the final time it happens in this method, we can actually check to make sure it happens, unlike the one above. So, should set is submitting to false. And then third and finally, very similar to the test we've got here. In fact, we can just copy and paste this whole test, put it here, but we want it set to false, and we want it the second time it's called. And we can get rid of this. Now, notice that I've still left this space here because we have our arrange, act, assert. It's not really necessary, but I like it because at a glance I can see what's happening. So, first test here, we basically want fixture dot submit form. We expect that the worker gets set to the return value. Now, what we need to be sure of is that worker did not equal that value to start off with. So, the best way to do this is go fixture.worker equals undefined. We know at this point it's now undefined. So what we need to do is check if, once this is called, to equal, and the response is passed in, and if I take this and make it a global variable, it means we won't be repeating ourselves. Cool. So now both of these can use this response in the before each. Let's save to make sure that works. I'd be shocked if it didn't. Of course it didn't, because this is actually being set to false now. Sorry, that was a copy and paste error. One of the downsides of copy and pasting stuff all the time. Now, the final thing is this should be set to false. We do the exact same thing that we did here. In fact, I'm just going to take this whole test, put this here. This is submitting. Same thing here, should equal false. You can also do, just while we're on the subject, you can do to be false or falsy. There's lots of things like that. To be undefined if you want it to still be set to undefined. I like to be a bit explicit with stuff here. Right, let's save this. There you go. That is all of the tests that we need for success. And now we're going to jump down in here, down to here on the failure. Now, because we are calling a method here, this is actually another pretty typical way that I would do my successes and my failures, because they tend to be a lot more complex than just setting a worker or setting is submitting to true or false. So here we just want one simple test that is, it should call with thrown error. So we do this in a very, very similar way to above. If we had a lot of error state ones here, we'd use a before each, but we don't, we have one. So I'm going to put that straight in here. Throw error. And we should probably give it an error here. So if we go error, let's create an error here. HTTP error. Response equals, but I'm not going to put all of the error stuff in here, so we'll do that. We'll give it a status of 401, and let's give it a message saying, you are not logged in. There you go. So we've got this error we're passing down here. We need to now call our method the same as we do everywhere else. Call this, and then an expect. And we expect this to be called. So we know from doing our previous test before, we need to have a const here, which is a spy, equals jest.spy on fixture. We've created our spy here. We're going to go to be called with, and we want it to be called with our error that we've just created here. This should pass. And there we have it. That is all of the tests for our submit working form. It's a good amount of tests. We're up to 10 tests now for a very simple component, but I think you'll agree that although there's a lot of tests there, we're getting a lot of benefit from there. We've already picked up a couple of bugs in my code, and also they're pretty easy to throw together. There's just a lot of copying and pasting. I think that's actually where we're going to stop today. I was hoping to get onto promises, but I'm aware this video is getting quite long. But if that is something that you feel like you'd like to see, let me know down below, and I'm happy to do a separate video on just promises. If there's anything you feel I've skipped over a little bit too much, I'm happy to do separate videos. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe, like it, give me a thumbs up, share it with your friends. Other than that, take care everyone and be safe.